All right, so I'm going to try not to do too many videos like this, but I just really wanted to do kind of sort of like an explainer video about my channel and just give a couple of my thoughts on the channel, language learning, learning Greek, maybe my background, just real short. So I kind of want to try to avoid doing too many things like this, because I feel like when I search for resources for learning Greek, especially if we're talking about biblical Greek or ancient Greek, YouTube will only show me content that's just people talking about Greek. In fact, they're usually even just talking about textbooks that you can buy. There's not a lot of actual Greek content. That's going to be different, of course, if you're doing modern Greek, but for the ancient languages, it's just not easy to find anyway. I don't know, maybe it's there and I just can't find it, but when I search YouTube, it doesn't come up. And it doesn't come up in recommendations either, and I'll watch these videos of these channels, and by the end I'm like, man, do you even study Greek, or are you just talking about Greek the whole time? And I don't know, maybe they do, I don't know, but my point is you don't see it in the videos. And so I want this channel to really focus more on actual content that's helpful. So there may be maybe sometimes where I'll talk a little bit about my personal methods of study. I'm not going to do that right now. I just have some thoughts, and it's kind of going to be a little important because my first couple videos I made, I was using modern Greek pronunciation, and I'm going to make some slight changes to my pronunciation. I don't know if that annoys anyone who liked my other videos. I apologize. I probably won't redo the old videos. And so to explain my thoughts on that, I'm actually going to start a little bit with my background. So I've studied different languages, most of them just at a really beginner level. And, I find for the language learning space, when you search for advice on how to learn a language on the internet, when you search for resources, most of it covers the very beginner level, and it's hard to get past that. And you can't do anything very useful with that information just at the beginner level. But I've studied quite a few languages at just a very beginner level. And when I was in college, I actually wanted to study Hebrew. I had been studying Hebrew prior to this, and I joined college and I wanted to study Hebrew, but Hebrew was only offered, the first class of Hebrew was only offered every other year at my college, and Greek was offered every year. So the year that I started, Hebrew wasn't available. So first year Hebrew wasn't available. They were on second year Hebrew. So I had to start with Greek. Started with Greek, fell in love with it. I did, just to continue the closing of the story, I did continue on then with Hebrew, but life stuff got too heavy and I never really got very far with Hebrew. I never really got past the beginner stages. So I studied, I didn't specify, I studied Koine Greek in college, Koine Kini. I'll say Koine because that's how I learned to say it in English. So I studied Koine Greek in college. I studied 3 years of it. So I would have studied more, but they didn't offer more at my college, but I definitely liked it. I studied 3 years. It used the Erasmian pronunciation, which is kind of the important part of the story here. I want to focus on pronunciation for a second. And it was 100% grammar translation. So it was Bible college, and in their defense, to be honest, the people that they're teaching are not going to sit down and just read the Greek 99% of the time. And they don't have that as a goal even. Like, not only is it like a goal that they fail to complete, but they don't even have it as a goal. That's not the goal. So, so they focus more on just being able to translate efficiently. That is not really a good way to learn a language. And now that things are said and done, I'm not so sure if maybe it is really an okay way to start off with a language, but I don't want to get this kind of a tangent thought. It doesn't get you to the end goal of being able to think in the language, read the Greek New Testament, produce output in Greek, any of those kinds of things. What it did do, though, is I studied grammar, basically. I studied Greek grammar for 3 years. So even still, this has been, what are we at? We're at, I think, 17 years since I graduated. So it's crazy that it's been that long. But, and I haven't used Greek very much since, which I'll continue on with that story. That's going to relate again to pronunciation, which is really the focus of this video. And yeah, so I studied 3 years of Greek, mostly Greek grammar. I still remember a lot of it, just because I studied it so intensely. It was such a big part of my coursework that I was doing. And yeah, when I got done, then, I knew I wasn't able to use the language, right? I couldn't think in it. My reading was very limited. I could read little pieces of some of the easier text and kind of not translate it in my head, but more often than not, I was translating in my head as I was reading it, and it just never stuck. It never felt memorable. I was just struggling. And I thought, man, kind of the same stuff I thought now, because I did some research about like how to learn a language, and I didn't really think that this was the best way to learn, like, say, a modern living language that you're actually going to think in, speak, and use, maybe if you're lucky, even dream in. And so I was like, I want to learn a modern language so I know how to do that, so I really know from experience how to do that. And I started with modern Greek, logical, and if I was to tell someone the perfect way to go about studying ancient Greek, I probably would start with a modern language first. I'm not really so sure if it matters that your modern language is modern Greek. I just can't say. I'd have to do it really to answer. I could see some things that are potentially pluses and minuses. So obviously there's some vocabulary overlap, but I'm assuming there's also some false overlap as well, where you might get some wrong definitions. Yeah, I don't know. It's probably better to learn modern Greek first. I just can't really say for sure. But I will say the reason that I switched away from learning modern Greek is because, there's not a whole lot of speakers, and the majority of the speakers that I could find on the internet, at least, spoke English super well. And that made it a real problem whenever I wanted to practice and I sound like a caveman, because they would immediately just switch to English. So I found that really challenging. And for better or for worse, that's the reason that I switched. Then I switched and studied Russian. I've studied Russian for a little over 10 years now. I've got a high degree of ability, a degree where I feel comfortable now, and I feel like I know what works for me to try to get me to think in a language, basically just that, to get to a point where I think in a language. Although interestingly, my reading ability in Russian is still not high enough to where I could pick up, just any old book written for native speakers and by educated speakers and just read it comfortably and fully understand it. And that's what my expectation is in Greek, right? I want to pick up the New Testament. We have different authors, different writing styles, and I think that after just a brief period of study, I'm going to be able to just pick that up and read it. It's kind of mind-blowing now to think about that. But now let me get back to the main point of the video right now is about pronunciation. So I learned Erasmian pronunciation in college, and then it just always felt clunky. It didn't feel like a real language. And when I would listen to it, my brain wasn't thinking. It just was hard. It was hard to listen to. It was hard to get my brain to focus on it as if it was a language. So I studied modern Greek. Then I stopped with Greek altogether for a little while I was working on Russian. And then when I decided to come back, I did a little research on the pronunciation, and I decided I was going to switch to modern Greek. There's compelling arguments for why you'd use modern Greek pronunciation. One of the biggest ones, honestly, is just that there's so much good audio material using the modern Greek pronunciation, and it's been a number of years since I searched, but at the time there was not very much in Erasmian pronunciation, and what was there still sounded clunky, even though it was professionally made. So that's a big plus, actually. It's a very big plus. So I switched to modern Greek pronunciation, and it was actually really hard. Like, I remember when I was researching it, they're like, oh, it's no big deal. The changes are minor. There's not very many changes. But I found that when I switched, it took me a lot of effort to get over, like, it felt like I was learning a new language. And I couldn't listen to stuff with, I struggled switching between hearing something in one pronunciation versus the other pronunciation. And it was really hard. It was a lot harder than I thought it was going to be and what other people made it sound like it was going to be. But I made the switch. And then, I didn't do much with Greek again for a few years. And then I pulled it out and tried to do a little bit. Then I didn't do anything for a few years. And so now we're at a point I kind of have been thinking about doing more with Greek. I'm not sure how much. I'm not sure how committed I'm going to be to the channel or the effort, because it's not at the top of my priority list. It falls down a little bit. And I put so much effort into Russian. I don't want to lose my Russian ability, because of working on this, and I have work and other obligations. But yeah, so I decided to put some effort into this. And as you'll see now, I recorded a couple videos, and I really enjoyed those. I personally enjoy watching them. I rewatch them all the time, and it helps me. I find that I was like repicturing the images from my videos, like just later on. I'll be laying down to go to sleep, and all of a sudden some of the images and some of the phrases will come into my mind. And I liked that. I thought it was very nice. What really irked me, though, and what I actually put it down again for a number of months, because I went to make those videos, and you're doing like, basic sentences, phrases with basic pronouns and stuff. And I'm like, there are homonyms that just should not be. There's no reason that any language in the world should have certain words, key words, common words, grammatical words as homonyms. It makes it gibberish when you try to read it out loud, or when you try to say it or pronounce it. And they're common words. They're words that are required for small, simple phrases. And the difference between or and the difference between, I think it's a you and they, right? Those should not be homonyms. It just doesn't make any sense. And I actually just completely stopped again for a number of months, because I was like, what am I going to do? This is driving me nuts. And then I started doing a little more research on the reconstructed. Technically, Erasmian is reconstructed, but usually when people say reconstructed, they mean something in between Erasmian and modern. So I did some research on the reconstructed pronunciations, and I'm hooked. I'm sold. So that's the reason for this video. I'm going to be switching my audio pronunciation to something like sort of a reconstructed, and I'll give some caveats and some explanations in a second. So I don't know if I'm going to re-upload my original videos. I probably will just keep them. And here's why, and also here's what I plan on doing with the reconstructed. So I really like the Lucian reconstructed. I watched, I think his name's Luke. I watched his videos. And it's hard because he has so many videos where he goes on and on and on about the reasons why and various things. And it's hard to find one with just a short, like, this is a pronunciations, how you pronounce this letter, this letter, this letter, that should be like 5 minutes. But anyway, so I found his. I really like his, and I'm sort of going to use that. But when I say sort of going to use that, I've also come to the conclusion that, I like when I study Russian, for example, when I study a language, I really like pronouncing as accurately as I can. It's actually very important to me. So it really annoys me to not have that ability here. But what I'm going to do is just kind of pick and choose, more or less. I wrote down his things that he recommended. I'm not going to sit there and force them. I'm not going to stick to every one of them. And actually, now that I've done modern and Erasmian, I'm going to kind of probably accidentally let things slip in every now and then. So It's going to be just my own pronunciation, I guess, in that way. And it's not necessarily based on some historical thing, because people get into that stuff and it's fine, but I just want to use the language. At the end of the day, I just want to use the language. And the Erasmian camp claims that too. The problem is it's just so robotic sounding. Like for me, my brain rejects it and says, this isn't really language. This is just nonsense. So I think that the Lucian or the reconstructed ones are pretty similar to each other. So one of those reconstructed forms is really nice. And then just to summarize mine real quick, pretty much I think I'm sticking with the Erasmian vowels, but the modern diphthongs and consonants. And then what happens is I occasionally mix up and use the wrong one, because I've got a lot of experience using the wrong one. For certain words, I'm just so used to that word with the other pronunciation, I'll use the other pronunciation. And then I've also noticed that actually, even though I'm using the Erasmian vowels, if I just kind of slur them a little bit, they almost sound like the modern vowels. And so if I do pronounce it with the modern vowel, it just sounds like I was sloppy with my speech, but maybe I can still hear it as the Erasmian vowel, or the reconstructed vowel. So that's kind of a little bit about that, what my plan is. And then finally, I don't know, but next, here's a benefit that I did not expect. So I noticed that as I'm using this kind of reconstructed pronunciation that's like halfway between Koine pronunciation, Erasmian pronunciation and modern pronunciation, I'm finding that it's because it feels like it's halfway between the two, I'm sort of able to hear the other two as just funny accents. Whereas modern and Erasmian are so different, my brain could not accept that it was the same language, and I felt like I had to start from the beginning. But now that I'm using this reconstructed, as I'm practicing, so I'll sit down with a blank piece of paper and I'll just try to write down whatever Greek words come to my mind. I did this in Russian for many, many months, and it was really helpful for me personally to do that. And I find that as I'm doing that, when I was just using, because I tried doing this too when I had the modern pronunciation. I didn't try doing it way back with Erasmian because I just didn't have that as a study method at the time. But when I did the modern pronunciation, none of the words that I learned, like I never recalled a word and thought, oh, this is that time in college when this and this thing happened. It felt like a new word. But now that when I was using the modern, and I would recall, it would just recall me back to moments of learning it as a modern pronunciation. Now that I'm doing this like halfway between pronunciation, I find that both moments come to my head. So like just today, there was a couple words that jumped into my head that I remember like where I was at when I learned them in college using the Erasmian pronunciation. But here I am using like this like hybrid pronunciation, and I was still able to have those jump into my brain because the pronunciation's close enough that my brain was like, oh, maybe this is what you want back here in your memory. And but I was also having the same thing still with the modern words, because it's close enough that it would be like, oh yeah, this is that like word that you learned at this time over here in this situation. That doesn't always happen, but every now and then words do jump into my head with like a scenario that relates to when I learned it. And I find that now that I'm doing this like kind of hybrid pronunciation, I can kind of feel like the other two are just funny accents. And I think that's also beneficial because I really feel like this is where, I just started with this, so I have to project what I think will happen in the future. But I really think that's going to allow me to get the best out of both worlds, because I really feel like I can still listen to something with a modern pronunciation and just kind of be like, so I'll say yine. That's my new way of saying it. In Erasmian, I think it was gune, which just, but it's close. It still feels kind of like the same word, but just someone who has a different native language and really bad pronunciation spoke it, And then in the modern one, it's yini. And so, again, those are close enough that I'm kind of able to feel like I'm bridging this gap between both. And the one more thing, again, that people often use this as a reason to use Erasmian, but I just think there's other reasons not to use Erasmian to where it's not a good enough. I think the logic doesn't lead, like the logic that they use to argue for Erasmian, this particular one that I'm about to mention, doesn't really lead you to Erasmian. I think leading you to some form of reconstructed would actually be the place where it would naturally lead. And that's, saying that, our focus is just on reading the language, right? Because I don't need to speak it. I don't care to speak it. I'm going to try to speak it just to get it in my head. But the actual thing that I want to do is to be able to read it. And so the other thing that's interesting and that makes Greek kind of hard is you're dealing with Greek over thousands of years and many geographical regions. And like, especially since, my interest is going to be in New Testament, they probably had funny accents anyway, right? They weren't native Greek speakers, or they weren't, if they were native Greek speakers, it might be like, so like to an American, there's many native English speakers in India who we would, do not have American sounding accents and are sometimes really hard for us to understand. It's like, it's their own unique thing. But they're still native speakers because I think so. I'm not super familiar with India, but because I think sometimes they grow up speaking it in certain areas over there. So hopefully that was a good analogy, but that's the analogy that I think would be valid for Jews in the early century who were Greek speakers. You had some who Greek wasn't their first language, but maybe you had others who, even though Greek was their first language, they probably wouldn't have sounded like a Greek from Greece. They probably would have had some kind of funny accent that was more local, even though it was technically their native language. And so I think that, yes, it's true that on the one hand, the pronunciation doesn't matter, but it's also true that the pronunciation still needs to feel like a language. It needs to be close to the written text, although it doesn't have to be too close when you have languages like English and French that are often not close to the written text. And it should not have homonyms that just for key, simple, common words that are key grammatical markers should not be homonyms. So that's why I think that that's where I want to go with it. That's why I'm going to make the switch. At the end of the day, though, I also hope it might make my videos useful to people on either end of the spectrum. So like for me, I'm going to be able to hear modern Greek pronunciation as just kind of a funny accent, but still recognize the words. And I can hear Erasmian as a kind of a funny accent, but still be able to recognize the words. I'm hoping the same will be true for each person in that camp. Maybe they can, watch my video while they're reading along with the text. And even though they like and use Erasmian, they'll still be able to follow along and get value out of my videos. And same for the guys that are in the modern Greek camp. So that's where I'm going. That's where I'm going with things. And that's just a little bit about my background,